The morning sun streamed through the tall glass windows of First National Bank, catching dust particles that danced in the air. It was Monday, always the busiest day of the week. Customers stood in lines, some checking their watches, others scrolling on their phones. The sound of clicking keyboards and quiet chatter filled the room. At exactly 10:17 am, the heavy glass doors swung open, and the cool air from outside rushed in. An old black man stood in the doorway, taking a moment to catch his breath. He was 78 years old, with skin that told stories of decades under the sun and eyes that had seen the world change more times than most could imagine. His name was Walter Johnson. He wore overalls that had faded from many washes, a plaid shirt with a patch on one elbow, and a hat that had lost its shape years ago. In one hand, he gripped a wooden cane worn smooth from years of use. Under his other arm, he carried a burlap sack, the kind folks used to carry potatoes in the old days. The security guard, a young man with a freshly pressed uniform, looked up from his post. His eyes followed Walter as he made his way across the shiny marble floor, his work boots making a soft thudding sound with each step. The line of waiting customers parted without a word, some out of respect for his age, others out of curiosity. Walter didn't join the line. Instead, he headed straight for the manager's desk at the back of the room. The bank manager, a woman in her 30s with perfectly styled hair and a crisp blue suit, was typing on her computer. She looked up, surprised, as Walter stopped in front of her desk. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her voice polite but with an edge that suggested she had more important things to do. Walter set his sack down on her desk, right on top of a stack of papers. "Yes, ma'am, you sure can," he said, his voice deep and clear despite his age. "I've come to claim what's mine." The manager's eyebrows rose slightly. "And what might that be?" Walter straightened his back, standing as tall as his old bones would allow. "This bank," he said simply. "This bank belongs to me." For a moment, there was silence. Then the manager laughed, a short, sharp sound that bounced off the marble walls. A nearby teller looked over, and the manager rolled her eyes, making a small spinning motion with her finger next to her head. "Sir," she said, still smiling, "I think you might be confused. This is First National Bank. It's owned by a corporation, not by any one person." More employees had noticed now. A loan officer snickered behind his hand. The security guard took a few steps closer, ready to step in. Walter didn't seem bothered by their reactions. He didn't raise his voice or get angry. He simply reached for his sack and began to untie the string that held it closed. "My grandfather built his business on this very spot," Walter said, his fingers working slowly on the knot. "Back in 1892. The land was his, bought and paid for. And when they drove him out, they stole more than just his dignity." The manager's smile faded a bit. Another customer had joined the small crowd watching. "Sir, that's a very interesting story, but—" Walter pulled out a stack of yellowed papers from his sack. They were tied with a faded ribbon, carefully preserved despite their age. "It ain't a story," he said quietly. "It's history, my history, and I got the papers to prove it." The manager's phone rang, but she didn't pick it up. Something in Walter's eyes, a mix of determination and pain, made her pause. "Why don't you come to my office?" she said finally, standing up. "Mr. Johnson," Walter replied. "Walter Johnson, grandson of Samuel Johnson, the rightful owner of this land." As they walked toward her office, Walter moved slowly but with purpose. The laughter had died down. In its place was a strange tension, like the air before a storm. No one was laughing anymore. The bank manager's office was cool and quiet, a world away from the busy lobby. Walter lowered himself carefully into the leather chair across from her desk, his old joints protesting. He placed his burlap sack on his lap, one hand resting protectively on top of it. "Mr. Johnson," the manager began, folding her hands on the desk, "my name is Mrs. Chen. I've been managing this branch for 8 years now. In all that time, no one has ever claimed to own our bank." Her voice was polite but firm. Walter nodded. "No disrespect intended, ma'am, but I'm not claiming to own just your branch. I'm saying my family owned this land. This very spot where we're sitting right now." Mrs. Chen leaned back in her chair. "And you say this was your grandfather's land?" "That's right. Samuel Johnson was his name." Walter's eyes seemed to look beyond the office walls, back into the past. Born in 1865, the year the war ended. The year folks like us were supposed to be free. He untied his sack and carefully pulled out a worn leather-bound journal. The edges were cracked with age, the pages yellow and fragile. He opened it with gentle fingers to a page marked with an old ribbon. My grandfather wrote everything down. He wasn't supposed to know how to read and write, but his mama had worked in a big house, and she learned in secret. Then she taught him. Walter turned the journal so Mrs. Chen could see the neat, careful handwriting that filled the pages. This here tells how he worked 16 hours a day in the coal mines, how he saved every penny, how in 1891 he had enough to buy a plot of land on Main Street, this very spot. Mrs. Chen's eyes narrowed as she studied the journal entries. Walter continued, his voice soft but clear. Granddaddy built a store here, sold tools and seed to farmers, black and white alike. Did real good business too. Walter pulled out a faded sepia photograph. It showed a proud black man standing in front of a wooden storefront. The sign above read Johnson's General Goods. That's him there, Walter said, tapping the photograph with a weathered finger. And look behind him, see that oak tree? That same tree stood in your parking lot until about 15 years ago when it got struck by lightning. Mrs. Chen's eyes widened slightly. She remembered the tree. Walter's face darkened as he continued. 1899 was when trouble came. Bad times for folks like us in these parts. A group of men came one night, told Granddaddy he had till morning to leave town. Said a black man had no business owning prime property on Main Street. He pulled out another document, this one clearly a property deed. He grabbed what he could carry, his most important papers, a little money, left everything else behind. His home, his store, his life's work. Walter's voice didn't waver, but his eyes held generations of pain. My daddy was just 5 years old. They'd fled north in the night, ended up in Ohio. Granddaddy tried to fight it legally, sent letters to the county courthouse. But back then, he shook his head. Justice wasn't available to folks like us. Mrs. Chen studied the deed with growing concern. It was stamped with an official-looking seal. The land was stolen, plain and simple, Walter continued. A year later, they sold it to the railroad company, then to a factory owner. Then in 1932, First National bought it and built this bank. He looked directly at Mrs. Chen. But stealing don't make it legally theirs. Not then, not now. The air conditioning hummed in the background as Mrs. Chen flipped through the documents. How did you find all this? She finally asked. Walter's expression softened slightly. My daddy kept everything Granddaddy saved. Talked about it sometimes, but he was a peaceful man. Said fighting over the past wouldn't change it. He reached into the sack one more time. Then last spring, after Daddy passed at 96, I was clearing out his attic. Found this sack in an old trunk, started reading. He pulled out more papers, letters, newspaper clippings, more photographs. Truth's been waiting a long time to come to light, Walter said. I figure it's waited long enough. Mrs. Chen reached for her phone. I need to call our legal team. 3 days later, Walter found himself sitting at a long table in the bank's conference room. The morning light filtered through vertical blinds, casting striped shadows across the polished wood. His burlap sack sat beside him like an old friend. Across from him sat Mrs. Chen, looking tense. Next to her was a man in an expensive gray suit who had introduced himself as Mr. Wilson, the bank's head lawyer. 2 other people from the legal team sat further down, already flipping through copies of Walter's documents. Thank you for coming back, Mr. Johnson, Mrs. Chen said. Her voice was polite but cooler than before. The warmth she'd shown in their first meeting had faded. Mr. Wilson cleared his throat. We've had time to review the materials you provided, he said, adjusting his glasses. While they are certainly interesting historical artifacts, they don't constitute a legal claim to this property. Walter didn't react right away. He'd expected this. He reached into his sack and pulled out another folder, this one newer than the others. I figured you might say that, he said calmly. That's why I spent 5 years getting everything checked out before I came here. He opened the folder and slid it across the table. Inside were letters from university professors, certified analyses of the paper and ink from his grandfather's documents, and reports from handwriting experts. The Historical Society confirmed these are genuine, Walter said, and that deed is real. The county recorder's office still has the original entry in their books from 1891. One of the younger lawyers looked up sharply. Mr. Wilson's expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened slightly on his pen. Even if these documents are authentic, Mr. Wilson said, there's a statute of limitations on property claims. You can't come in more than 100 years later and expect. Except when there's proof of fraud, Walter interrupted gently. He pulled out another document. This here is a letter from the county sheriff to my grandfather, dated 1907. It says, and I quote, "Your claim has been reviewed and rejected due to lack of proper documentation." Walter looked up, his eyes steady. But Granddaddy had proper documentation. They just refused to accept it from a black man. That's fraud, plain and simple. A heavy silence fell over the room. One of the younger lawyers whispered something to Mr. Wilson, who frowned and shook his head slightly. Walter continued, his voice gaining strength. I visited the county archives last year. Found records showing the men who threatened my grandfather later became town officials. Found records showing how they divvied up his land between themselves before selling it off at a profit. He pulled out more papers, photocopies of old town records, land transfers, newspaper clippings. These men broke the law. They committed crimes. And First National Bank eventually benefited from those crimes when they bought this land in 1932. The youngest lawyer, a woman with bright eyes, spoke up. The bank wouldn't have known the history when they purchased the land. Walter nodded. That's true enough, but now you do know. Mrs. Chen exchanged glances with Mr. Wilson. The tension in the room was thick enough to touch. What exactly are you looking for here, Mr. Johnson? Mr. Wilson asked finally. Financial compensation. Walter took his time answering. He ran his hand over the smooth wood of his cane, thinking. Justice comes in many forms, he said at last. Yes, there's money owed, not just the value of the land back then, but what it would have meant for my family over generations. The opportunities lost, the legacy stolen. He looked around the elegant conference room, taking in the expensive furniture, the artwork on the walls. But there's something else just as important to me. Recognition. Acknowledgement of what happened to Samuel Johnson and his family. He tapped the old photograph of his grandfather. This man built something from nothing. He deserved better than to have it all stripped away. His story deserves to be told. Mr. Wilson closed his folder with a snap. We'll need time to investigate these additional documents. The bank will conduct its own research into these claims. Walter gathered his papers back into his sack, his movements unhurried. Take all the time you need, he said. Truth don't spoil with age. As he stood to leave, he added, I'll be back in 2 weeks. Same time. It wasn't a question. 2 weeks passed. Walter arrived at the bank exactly on time, dressed in his best clothes, a navy blue suit that had seen better days, but was clean and pressed. He carried his burlap sack, now somewhat famous among the bank employees who whispered as he walked through the lobby. This time, he wasn't taken to the conference room. Instead, a young man in a suit escorted him to the top floor where the executive offices were located. The elevator doors opened to reveal a hallway with thick carpeting that swallowed the sound of their footsteps. Mrs. Reynolds will see you now, the young man said, opening a heavy wooden door. The office beyond was spacious, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. A woman stood up from behind an imposing desk. She was in her 60s, with silver hair cut in a sharp bob and a dark red suit that probably cost more than Walter's car. Mr. Johnson, I'm Patricia Reynolds, president of First National Bank. Her handshake was firm and quick. Please have a seat. Walter sat down, placing his sack carefully beside his chair. Mrs. Chen was there too, sitting in a corner with a notebook. Mr. Wilson stood by the window, his back half turned. I've reviewed your claims thoroughly, Mrs. Reynolds said without preamble. Our legal team has spent the past 2 weeks investigating your documents and researching the history of this property. Walter nodded but didn't speak. He'd learned long ago that sometimes silence was the best response. Mrs. Reynolds picked up a folder from her desk. Your documents appear to be authentic. The property deed, the journal entries, the photographs, all genuine. The Historical Society confirms that your grandfather did indeed own this land. A warm feeling spread through Walter's chest, but he kept his face calm. Finally, someone was acknowledging the truth. Then Mrs. Reynolds continued, her voice cooling. However, Mr. Johnson, authenticity doesn't equal a valid legal claim. Under state law, there's a 20-year statute of limitations on property disputes. Your claim expired roughly 80 years ago. The warm feeling vanished. Walter gripped his cane tighter. Moreover, Mrs. Reynolds went on, flipping through papers, there have been multiple owners since then, all with clear title transfers. First National purchased this property legally in 1932, with all proper documentation. She closed the folder with finality. While I sympathize with your family's history, the bank is under no legal obligation whatsoever. What happened to your grandfather was unfortunate, but it's ancient history now. Walter looked at her steadily. Ma'am, with all due respect, being forced off your land at gunpoint isn't unfortunate. It's a crime. Mrs. Reynolds sighed. Different times, Mr. Johnson. The legal system then wasn't what it is now. That's exactly my point, Walter said. The legal system failed my family once. I'm asking it not to fail us again. Mrs. Reynolds stood up, signaling the meeting was ending. I understand you believe you're fighting for justice, Mr. Johnson, but pursuing this further would be a waste of your time and resources. Our legal team would fight this vigorously, and you would lose. She walked around the desk and stood directly in front of him. As a gesture of goodwill, the bank is prepared to offer you a one-time payment of $5,000 to acknowledge your grandfather's connection to this property. In exchange, you'll sign a document releasing any claims against First National. $5,000 for land in the heart of downtown that was worth millions, for generations of lost opportunity. Walter almost laughed. Instead, he slowly got to his feet, picked up his sack, and looked Mrs. Reynolds in the eye. My grandfather didn't sell out when men came with torches and guns, he said quietly. I won't sell out for a check and a handshake. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. You think this is ancient history? History has a way of catching up, Mrs. Reynolds. I'll be seeing you again. He walked out with his head high. As the elevator doors closed behind him, he didn't see the young woman from the legal department who had been sitting quietly in the corner, watching everything with troubled eyes. She slipped out after him, her mind already turning over possibilities that no one in that room had considered. Walter stepped out of the bank into the bright sunshine. He had expected this outcome. But what the bank didn't know was that Walter Johnson never started a fight he wasn't prepared to finish. Walter sat on his porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink. His rocking chair creaked gently as he thought about the day's events. The bank had all but laughed him out of the building, just as he'd expected. But Walter had learned patience over his 78 years. Good things took time. The sound of a car pulling up made him look up. A small blue sedan had parked by his mailbox. A young woman stepped out, looking nervous. Walter recognized her immediately. She had been in the corner during his meeting with Mrs. Reynolds, taking notes and staying quiet. She walked up the path to his porch, clutching a leather bag. Mr. Johnson, I'm Lily Taylor. I work in the legal department at First National. Walter nodded but didn't speak. He just waited, rocking slowly. May I talk with you? She asked, glancing around as if worried someone might see her. Have a seat, Walter said, gesturing to the empty chair beside him. Nice evening for a visit. Lily sat down, her back straight with tension. What I'm doing could get me fired, she said bluntly. But I can't stop thinking about your case. What the bank is doing isn't right. Walter stopped rocking. Why do you care about an old man's problems? Lily opened her bag and pulled out a folder. My grandfather was a civil rights lawyer. He taught me that justice matters more than job security. She handed Walter the folder. I've been looking into your claim after hours. There's something the bank isn't telling you. Walter opened the folder. Inside were copies of documents he hadn't seen before, internal bank memos, old newspaper clippings, and what looked like court records. In 1932, when First National bought the land, Lily explained, there was a note in the purchase records mentioning a disputed claim by the Johnson colored family. The bank knew there was an issue with the title even back then. Walter's hands tightened on the papers. They knew. Yes, and there's more. Lily pointed to another document. The statute of limitations doesn't apply in cases of fraud. If someone actively hid information or lied to prevent you from making a claim, the clock doesn't start running until the fraud is discovered. Hope sparked in Walter's chest for the first time in weeks. And they hid information. Lily nodded, her eyes bright with excitement. The county records from 1899 to 1910 show the men who took your grandfather's land actively blocked his letters and legal inquiries. They'd used their positions in the town government to bury the paperwork. That's textbook fraud. Walter stared at the documents, trying to take it all in. After a moment, he looked up at Lily. "Why are you helping me? You're risking your job." Lily was quiet for a moment. "When I saw how they treated you in that office, offering you pennies for what's rightfully yours, something just broke inside me." She shook her head. "I've worked at that bank for 3 years. I've watched them foreclose on family homes while approving million-dollar bonuses for executives. What they did to your grandfather is just a bigger version of what they still do today." Walter studied her face, looking for any sign of deception. Finding none, he nodded slowly. "Even with these documents, I can't afford to fight the bank in court. They've got teams of lawyers and millions of dollars." "That's why I reached out to Professor Thompson at the law school," Lily said. "He specializes in historical property claims and civil rights cases. He wants to meet you." Walter's eyebrows rose. "The Thomas Thompson? The one who's always on TV talking about justice?" Lily smiled. "The very same. He thinks your case could set an important precedent for other families who had land stolen during that era. He's willing to represent you pro bono, free of charge." For the first time in a long while, Walter felt the weight on his shoulders lighten. He looked down at his burlap sack, which contained all his grandfather's documents. "Samuel Johnson was a proud man," Walter said softly. "He built something from nothing, only to have it torn away. He deserved better." He looked up at Lily, a new determination in his eyes. "Let's talk to this professor." As the last light of day faded from the sky, two unlikely allies, an elderly black man and a young bank lawyer, began to plan how to right a wrong that was over a century old. Sometimes justice took its time, but it always found its way eventually. 3 weeks later, the lobby of First National Bank was busier than usual. Customers whispered to each other, pointing discreetly at the news vans parked outside. Bank employees moved nervously between desks, their usual routines disrupted by the tension in the air. At exactly 10 a.m., the glass doors swung open. Walter Johnson walked in, leaning on his cane. But this time he wasn't alone. Beside him walked Professor Thompson, a tall man with gray hair and the confident posture of someone used to commanding courtrooms. Behind them came Lily, looking professional but clearly anxious, and most surprising of all, a news crew followed them in, cameras rolling. Mrs. Chen spotted them first. Her eyes widened, and she quickly picked up a phone. Within seconds, security guards appeared, moving toward the group. "Sir, you can't film in here," one guard said to the cameraman. "This is private property." Professor Thompson smiled politely. "Actually, that's exactly what we're here to discuss." "Whose private property is it, really?" The guard looked confused. By now, other customers had stopped their banking business to watch. Some were pulling out phones, recording the scene. Mrs. Reynolds appeared from her office, her face tight with anger. "Mr. Johnson, this is highly inappropriate. If you have legal concerns, your lawyer can contact ours. You can't just barge in here with cameras." Professor Thompson stepped forward, hand extended. "Thomas Thompson, representing Mr. Johnson. We did try to contact your legal team. They declined our calls, all 5 of them." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "We're here to present new evidence in Mr. Johnson's case, evidence that proves First National Bank knowingly purchased stolen property in 1932. Mrs. Reynolds' face paled slightly. She glanced at the cameras, then at the growing crowd of curious customers. "My office. Now, without the cameras." "I'm afraid the cameras stay," Professor Thompson said calmly. "Mr. Johnson has been silenced long enough. His story deserves to be heard." The news reporter stepped forward. "Mrs. Reynolds, Channel 7 News. Would you care to comment on documents showing your bank has known about the Johnson family claim for nearly 90 years? Mrs. Reynolds forced a tight smile. "First National takes all claims seriously. We're not aware of any valid." "That's not true," Lily interrupted, her voice shaking slightly. She stepped forward, holding up a stack of papers. These internal memos from 1932 explicitly mention the Johnson dispute and instruct staff to avoid all reference to previous ownership issues. A murmur ran through the crowd. More phones came out, recording everything. Mrs. Reynolds shot Lily a look that could have frozen water. "Ms. Taylor, you're in violation of your confidentiality agreement. Your employment is terminated, effective immediately." "That's fine," Lily replied, her voice stronger now. "I'd rather be unemployed than complicit." Walter had remained quiet until now, but he finally spoke, his deep voice carrying across the lobby. "I didn't come here looking for trouble. I came looking for justice. My grandfather built something from nothing, only to have it stolen away because of the color of his skin." He held up his burlap sack. "Everything I need to prove it is right here. And now the whole world's gonna know the truth." A customer in line, an older woman with white hair, suddenly stepped forward. "I want to hear his story," she announced loudly. Others nodded in agreement. Mrs. Reynolds looked around at the growing crowd, the cameras, the curious faces of her own employees. For the first time, she looked uncertain. Professor Thompson seized the moment. "We're prepared to file a lawsuit today. Fraud, conspiracy, unjust enrichment, the works. It'll be tied up in courts for years, with your bank's name dragged through every headline." He lowered his voice. "Or we can sit down like reasonable people and discuss how First National plans to make this right." The tension in the lobby was thick enough to cut. Customers were completely abandoning their business to watch. Bank tellers had stopped working. Mrs. Reynolds took a deep breath. "Mr. Wilson will show you to the conference room," she said stiffly. "The rest of you," she addressed the crowd, "this is a private matter." But it was too late. It wasn't private anymore. As Walter followed Mrs. Reynolds toward the back, customers applauded. Someone called out, "Don't let them bully you, old-timer." Walter nodded in acknowledgement, his back straighter than it had been in years. The truth was finally coming to light, and there was no putting it back in the shadows. 2 months later, the steps of First National Bank were crowded with people and cameras. A small stage had been set up, complete with a podium and chairs. The bank had closed early for what they were calling a special community announcement. Walter sat in the front row, dressed in a new suit. His old burlap sack rested on his lap. Beside him sat his daughter and 3 grandchildren, all dressed in their Sunday best. They held hands, their faces a mix of pride and disbelief. Mrs. Reynolds approached the podium, looking humbler than anyone had ever seen her. Gone was the cold authority she'd shown in her office. Today, she looked like someone who had learned a difficult lesson. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice carrying across the crowd. "Today marks an important day in the history of First National Bank and in the history of our community." Cameras flashed as reporters leaned forward. The story of Walter Johnson and his fight for justice had spread far beyond their small city. It had become national news, sparking discussions about historical injustice and corporate responsibility across the country. Over the past 2 months, our bank has undergone a thorough examination of its history, Mrs. Reynolds continued. What we discovered was troubling. In 1932, when First National purchased this property, our founders were indeed aware that the land had been wrongfully taken from Samuel Johnson, a successful black business owner. A murmur ran through the crowd. Even though the story had been in the news, hearing the bank officially admit it was something else entirely. The documents presented by Mr. Walter Johnson, Samuel's grandson, are legitimate. The historical record is clear. This land was stolen through intimidation and violence, and our institution benefited from that injustice, even if unknowingly by later generations. Mrs. Reynolds paused, looking directly at Walter. "Mr. Johnson, on behalf of First National Bank, I offer our sincere apology. What happened to your family was wrong. We cannot change the past, but we can acknowledge it honestly and work to make amends." Walter nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Mrs. Reynolds gestured to a bank employee who brought forward a large framed item covered with a cloth. "Today, we are unveiling a permanent memorial that will be displayed in our main lobby." She pulled away the cloth to reveal a beautiful bronze plaque with Samuel Johnson's photograph and story engraved upon it. Below was a second photograph, Walter's. "This plaque ensures that the true history of this land will never be forgotten," Mrs. Reynolds said, But words and symbols are not enough. She beckoned Walter to join her at the podium. Slowly he rose, leaning on his cane. His daughter helped him up the steps to the stage. The crowd applauded as he stood tall beside Mrs. Reynolds. "Mr. Johnson has agreed to settle his claim against First National Bank," Mrs. Reynolds announced. "While no amount of money can truly compensate for generations of lost opportunity, we have established a trust of $12 million for the Johnson family." Applause erupted from the crowd. Walter's grandchildren jumped to their feet cheering. Additionally, Mrs. Reynolds continued once the noise died down. First National is establishing the Samuel Johnson Foundation with a $50 million endowment. This foundation will provide business grants, educational scholarships, and home loans specifically for Black entrepreneurs and families in our community. More applause, even louder this time. "Mr. Johnson will serve as the honorary chairman of the foundation," Mrs. Reynolds added. "His wisdom and perspective will guide our efforts to create meaningful change." She stepped back from the podium, gesturing for Walter to speak. For a moment he just stood there, looking out at the sea of faces. Then he reached into his old burlap sack and pulled out the faded photograph of his grandfather. "My grandfather used to say that the truth is like water," Walter said, his voice strong despite his age. "You can dam it up for a while, but eventually it finds its way through." He held up the photograph so everyone could see. "Samuel Johnson didn't live to see this day. Neither did my father. But I have. And now my children and grandchildren know that justice may be slow, but it's never too late." Walter looked at the plaque with his grandfather's face. "Your story wasn't forgotten, Granddaddy. And now it never will be." As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the bank that once laughed at him, Walter Johnson finally felt at peace. His grandfather's legacy was secure at last.